Welcome to the Your Innovation Coach webinar. Today's topic is defining new products. So the first question to start off today is to talk about why defining new products is so important. And I think there are at least three good reasons. This slide illustrates one of them in a more humorous fashion, and that is that it's really necessary to have a clear definition, a written definition of a new product before you start development in order to make sure that there are clear expectations across all the different functional groups or stakeholders within a company. And so this slide illustrates that point. This might be the customer's vision of what that product is, but if you are relying on hallway conversations to define new products, then the different functional groups in the business may have really radically different views of what that new product needs to be. So having a well-written definition of a product is extremely important to get alignment across the project team and the organization. And the other two reasons I think is related to that is it helps to prevent scope creep. Once the project starts, if there's not really good alignment across the organization, then you're just more subject to scope creep, which can then lead to the third problem, and that is time to market. So having a well-crafted, defined product, written definition of a new product is really essential for at least those three reasons. I think that in my experience, companies make two primary mistakes when it comes to defining new products. First is they have no written definition at all and rely on hallway conversations to define a product. That may work perfectly well with a startup or for a very, very small company with a very compact project team, but really for most organizations who are running multiple projects, it's a dangerous proposition to rely on hallway conversations to define the product. And then secondly is, while an organization may actually have written definitions, they make a mistake assuming that they know what the customer wants, and so the definition is flawed. They end up developing a product that actually does not meet the requirements of the market and lead to a failure in the market. So those are the two big mistakes. What we're going to talk about today is a product definition model that hopefully will help address these two primary mistakes. This decision model is really meant to help address these two primary issues that I think a lot of companies have. But before we get to that, I want to make three comments. First is, I think when it comes to written product definition, there's a hierarchy, and there's a lot of different types of documents that will get generated along the way, some of which we've talked about in the past webinars. And I think at the base of this hierarchy is the most simple of the definitions, and that might be something like a product business case brief. I'll come back to that later in the presentation, just refresh your memory on what that is, but it's a single-page document that really gets generated as part of the portfolio process, where you are bringing new ideas into the company, and you have to try to find a way to define them minimally in order to make a reasonable apples-to-apples comparison between different ideas that are coming in, and then put those up against the other projects that you're currently working on. So that's really the essence of what we talked about in the portfolio management process webinar several months ago. So that happens at the very beginning. It's the most basic of the written product definitions. But as the project starts to unfold, then there are additional documents. The new product proposal, or you might call it a marketing requirements document, is typically part of the phase gate process. That's where I introduced that concept. And that is really the first formal long form type of written definition. it kicks off the project typically, and then as the project continues to unfold, then those marketing specifications are typically turned into what I would call product design specifications, which are really a more definition based on in engineering terms for particularly for a manufactured product. So the point is that, you know, there's a hierarchy that you start at the base, the fundamental, most basic product definition. Really, you build on that as you develop the product, and once you come to market, then these additional definitions are required. So that's the first point. The second point I want to make is there's obviously a relationship, as I've already alluded to, between defining a new product and the portfolio process, which is really meant to help align the organization, help prioritize ideas that are coming into the organization against products that you're working on currently, or products that you might have made the decision to work on but you're waiting for resources. So that's the portfolio process, and as I mentioned, that basic product business case brief is something that would get generated, you know, in the context of the portfolio process. And then as, of course, the project starts to unfold, the new product proposal or the marketing documents and product design specifications and so on and so forth are part of the phase gate. But the reality is there's a lot of iteration that goes on, and there's a lot of back and forth between the portfolio processes and particularly the early part of the phase gate, and in particular the new product proposal and the marketing document, because you may learn something in the early phases of the project that kicks it back all the way into the portfolio process. So the point of this slide is mainly to make the point that really product definition shouldn't be looked at as an event. It really should be looked at as an ongoing process. It starts with very basic definition in the portfolio process. It morphs into the new product proposal. In the beginning of the phase gate process, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of iteration, and then as the project proceeds, the product design specifications at that point, you know, it's the project is pretty far along, and so on and so forth. So again, it's important to remember that product definition is a process and not a singular event, and the reality is that what you go through internally to define these products and achieve alignment across the organization, that process is a lot more important than the actual written documents themselves. And the third point, before I introduce you to this decision model, is the realization that when you think about your projects that you work on within your organization, there are really three primary types of projects in my view, particularly in a manufacturing type of environment. One are product extensions or incremental developments on existing products. That might constitute 80% of the projects that you work on, and there's nothing wrong with that. That pays the bills, so to speak. But then there are what I would term new products, new in the sense that they are new to you but exist in the marketplace. So in this scenario, you're choosing to go into a new market maybe, but you're going to compete with an existing set of competitors, and you're developing a product in order to compete in that market space. And then finally, there are what I would term radical or new to the market type of developments. That's where you're going into a market basically that no one exists. It's blue ocean strategy. It's finding space that there is no competitor at this particular point. It may be related to a business model, it may be a new technology, it may be taking an existing market and developing a new technology to serve it, or serving an existing market in a new and unique way through a unique business model. So it can be a lot of different things, but it does not exist today. So in my view, when you really think about the projects that you're working on, they will fall into one of those three buckets, so to speak. Of course, there are a lot of other dimensions related to each individual type of project, you know, whether it's the technology, the manufacturing process, how you choose to do the project, whether it's incremental or, you bring it all out at once, or again, business models overlay on the 3 different primary project types. So it can get more complicated, but the reality is that I think if you think about your projects, they're going to be one of these 3. So with that kind of introduction, the rest of the talk I really want to spend on this product definition decision model, which I think brings a lot of different things together that we've talked about in the past webinars, and helps, I think, frame the discussion and on how you might want to think about how you are defining new products and what that really means. And so this is fairly complicated here, but we're going to just take it step by step and look at each of these decision points. And you know, the idea here is that the main point of this decision model is really to help address those 2 problems that I laid out at the very beginning of the talk, and that is that, you know, the companies rely on hallway conversations, or if they do a product definition, they assume they know what the customer wants. So hopefully this decision model addresses those 2 primary problems. So let's start up here. It really starts with the first question, and that is, and this goes back to the previous slide on the types of projects that you're working on, is this an incremental development of an existing technology or an existing product? And if the answer is yes, then let's follow through that leg. And the second question that you have to ask yourself, if it's in an incremental development, is, do we need to reevaluate our competitive strategy? So this is going to harken back to the webinar that we had last month on competitive strategy, and I'm going to refresh your memory on that here in some subsequent slides. But we will use that basic framework that we talked about last month, which is the maneuver strategy, which consists of 3 different specific strategies based on the context. So if the answer to that question is no, we don't need to reevaluate it, then you go straight to that need to develop the marketing document to kick off the project. So this is the simplest of the decisions basically that you would make, and the simplest in terms of getting to the point where you're ready to write the product definition. Because the reality is that if it's an incremental development, you're really not going to change the competitive strategy, then you pretty much can go right to writing the requirements for that development. And you'll see note 1, I think typically if you're following through on you know, to this point here, that type of a development is probably going to be driven by things like, number 1, it could be driven by cost reduction. So it's an existing product that you need to reduce the cost on. You might just be doing a product refresh. There are many industries, particularly in the consumer products market, where you just have to continually refresh your product in order to keep the distribution chain interested and so forth. It might be driven by regulatory requirements. Maybe there's a change in regulations that requires you to modify the design of the equipment. It really has nothing to do with, you know, per se with meeting the customer need, but it might just be required from a regulatory standpoint. And then the 4th one, maybe it's a planned enhancement based on a platform strategy. So you may have already kind of laid out a strategy where you're going to come out with a initial product, and then you're going to do a version 2 and a version 3. So this may be version 2 of an initial introduction, and so you pretty much already know what needs to be done. Maybe you're going to get some feedback based on the first version, and you know, and make those final decisions about what that definition needs to be. And then 5th on that note 1 is that more than likely the business model is going to stay the same. And you know, that's, again, this is kind of part and parcel of incremental development. Most things are going to stay the same here, and you're ready to drive right to the product definition. I think the primary risk here is, that you don't fall into the trap of overreaching the market need at that price point. I gave you an example of that in the webinar last month where, existing companies are very good at incrementally driving performance on their product, but they have to be careful that they don't overreach the market need at that particular price point, because as you continue to enhance your product, you may be continuing to increase the cost structure, and so it's easy to overreach the market. These, of course, are the easiest, the lowest risk projects, and like I said, this might constitute, this leg of this decision model might constitute 80% of your development. Back here, in terms of the competitive strategy, you may decide that yes, you really do need to relook at the competitive strategy. And so by default, and again, I'll come back to this in a couple slides here, but by default, your competitive strategy is really either going to be dislocation or disruption. You're basically choosing to compete in an existing market, so it's going to be one of those two strategies as far as competing with your competition. And there's a warning there. I think, again, you don't want to default to this war of attrition. In other words, as you develop this incremental product, you don't want to get so focused on just matching feature for feature with your competitors and just forgetting about what tactics you really need to use to accomplish the, to have the right competitive positioning. So if you are going to reevaluate that competitive strategy, then there are a set of tools that I'm going to recommend, that some of which we've talked about. We've spent a whole webinar on the business model canvas. I think it's an excellent tool to start thinking about your competitive strategy and the business model of your competitors and so on and so forth. And are there ways to relook at the business model as a way to get to a better competitive positioning? The other two tools I'm going to introduce today to you, the elements of value and design thinking. The arrows here imply that this can be an iterative process. You might need to experiment, and of course that's what design thinking is all about. It's really the lean methodologies to iterate and learn. So you're really using these tools to iterate through and go through a process in order to really then get to the product definition. But make no mistake, before you go into development, you do need a good, solid written definition, but there might be additional work that needs to be done before you get to that point. So basically this leg accommodates the realization that you may not always know exactly what you need, how you need to define that product in order to meet the customer need and your financial requirements. And that's what this is all about. Okay, so back over here, if you answered no, it's not an incremental development, then by default it's either going to be new or radical. And the input to that really is the product business case brief. So by definition, this is something that's new to you or new to the market. The input is really going to be more than likely the product business case brief that was developed as part of the portfolio process. That's going to be the input here. And then based on the answer to that question, whether it's new or radical, then you're going to follow down through one of these two other legs. So if it's new, that means, again, it's new to you but exists in the market. So by default, you're going to choose one of these two competitive strategies because it already exists in the market. There's an existing set of competitors. Again, you need to be careful about falling into the trap of a war of attrition, just simply trying to match feature to feature and go head-to-head with the existing competitors. That could be a big mistake unless you are the, you have the resources to actually win that battle over the long term. Again, this goes back to the webinar that we talked about, the concepts and the strategies that we talked about last month. And then again, you're going to come back here and use these same set of tools in order to iterate potentially and finally get to a product definition. And the same thing over here. If it's radical, again, by definition, your competitive strategy is preemption. In other words, you're trying to preempt any other competitors by going into a space that no one really is competing with at that particular point. So you've, by default, that's your competitive strategy. And again, use the same set of tools to potentially iterate and get to a product definition. So obviously these kind of projects are more difficult, higher risk compared to these types of projects which are kind of moderate risk, and then of course up here were the easiest, lowest risk projects. So the whole idea of this product definition decision model is it encompasses multiple different things. It encompasses the need to think about your competitive strategy. It encompasses various tools that you can use to get to a product definition, and it encompasses the concept that you don't always know exactly how to define a new product, and so there are things that you have to do potentially before that point in order to get to a good product definition and then go into to development. So now what I want to do is I want to come back and just refresh your memory on some of the written definition documents, the product business case brief, as well as the new product proposal and the product design specifications. Again, we covered this in the context of the portfolio management process. We covered these two documents in the context of the phase gate. So I'm trying to pull that all together now here, but I just want to refresh your memory on all those documents. So the product business case brief, this is the resource. There are lots of different forms of this type of a document that can be used for the early part of product definition. This happens to be one of my favorites. I think it's simple enough but has enough nuance in it to really be a good way to, as a first step, as new ideas come into the business, to have a way to try to make an apples to apples comparison. So it's got some description of the concept. It's got some assessment of the strategic impact using a qualitative assessment scale. It's got a nice financial risk analysis format where you can come up with a risk-adjusted NPV, and then you accommodate that with how many resources are going to be required. So you end up with basically an overall project rating that will allow you to come up with a single number to try to compare different opportunities on an apples-to-apples basis. Of course, it's not going to be the only information that you're going to use to decide whether you're going to push a project through the portfolio process and start to resource it and come into this decision model, but I think it's a really powerful tool that you can use at the portfolio level to start to try to define what a new product's going to be. And then of course as the project unfolds and you get into the phase gate where you need to develop a new product proposal or a marketing requirements document, then this would be a second type of document, formal document. I think it's important to remember, I think the danger here is sometimes organizations use this document as a project schedule, and in many cases that's a dangerous thing to predict when you're going to come to market, particularly if you need to go through some prototyping and some iterations in order to really figure out how to achieve some of the technical issues. Responsibility for really in general for product definition, I think, falls on typically a product manager. This gets into some of the organization issues we talked about in the past. And there are lots of different elements of this document. We're not going to go into the details. You can refer back to the discussion that we had in the phase gate process. But the point is that that's probably the first real long form, formal product definition, and typically would be used to kick off the project. And then as the project unfolds, the product design specifications, the third kind of primary category of written definition, is really taking those marketing specifications and turning them into the engineering terminology. So this is typically going to be engineering driven and really turns those marketing specifications into technical specifications and ultimately manufacturing test requirements. All right, the second thing I want to do is just touch back on the concept of the competitive strategy that we talked about in last month's webinar. If you recall, we highlighted what we called a maneuver strategy as a really nice framework to think about how you're competing. And I think this is a really nice mental model to think through your competitive strategy. And it's really based on 3 separate strategies, preemption being the ultimate. That's really where you're trying to find valuable unoccupied space before a competitor realizes it. So this is akin to the blue ocean strategy. It's really going to be, by definition, a radical new to the world type of development that we talked about. That's really, you're choosing that kind of competitive strategy. But it offers higher risk but higher reward. If you're going to be competing in an existing market, either with a new product as I defined it, or in an incremental product, then you're probably going to be using one of these 2 primary competitive strategies. One is dislocation, where you're really looking to try to find weaknesses in your existing customers, and there are 5 tactics that we use in this strategy. You either functional tactics or positional tactics, temporal tactics, or psychological or informational tactics. So, by evaluating the weaknesses in your customer or your competitors and trying to leverage your strengths, that's what this strategy is all about. If you can't find any weakness in how your competitors are competing, then you're really left with disruption. And that's really where you're just trying to disrupt the competitor from efficient operation. You're not going to put them out of business, but that's the last resort, because it's obviously the least value in terms of creating a unique competitive position. This is the resource tip. Jeffrey Phillips, who is a colleague of mine, wrote this book about a year ago. I really like this framework for thinking about your competitive strategy, and so you can use that as a resource, and or go back to the webinar that we had on competitive strategy. And finally, I want to touch on these 3 tools that I mentioned in the decision model. The business model canvas is something that we've talked about in the past. We had a whole webinar on this. I think it's an extremely powerful tool that you should be familiar with to help understand your business model, your competitors' business models, and envision new business models. It consists of 9 different segments: customer relationships, customer segments, channels, the value proposition, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very powerful tool, a very collaborative tool, and it really goes hand in hand with thinking through the competitive strategy, because so much of what we see today in terms of innovation really is related to the business model. A second tool I want to introduce you today can be used in the context of the business model, particularly in terms of understanding the customer segments. So one of the 9 segments in the business model is understanding your customers. What are their needs? There are a variety of tools that we use there: ethnography, the concept of jobs to be done, segmenting your market, all these tools that we can bring to bear, so to speak, on understanding our customers and what their needs are, particularly trying to put yourself in their place and looking at it from their perspective, not from your perspective. I think that's the most important point. And this Elements of Value really speaks to that. This is some work that was done by Bain & Company and published in Harvard Business Review last year. It's a concept based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that from your Psych 101 course in college. At the base of the pyramid are your functional needs. A lot of products satisfy some functional utilitarian type of purpose. But then there are higher level needs, emotional needs. And the reality is that we all buy products to some degree on emotion. It may be, for instance, reducing anxiety, reducing risk. That is satisfying an emotional need. It might come through some of the functional design elements of the product, but the reality is that it's satisfying an emotional need for you to reduce anxiety. And then there are higher level types of elements of value that are more life-changing and so forth. The reality is most B2B type businesses, most of the types of companies that I work with are really operating in these 2 levels. The research that Bain & Company did Basically, the bottom line is that the more of these elements that you can encompass into your product or your service, the more successful you're going to be. It makes intuitive sense, but this gives you a framework to think about that. So as you think through these different functional requirements, if you can satisfy at least 4 or more of these elements in how you design your product or the business model that your product works within, again, it's not always just related to the product itself, and that's a very important point. I keep coming back to that in all my webinars concerning the thinking about the business model. But this is a good way to a good tool to use in the concert with the customer segment part of the business model. The third tool is to incorporate into your thinking this concept of design thinking. And there are really 3 core elements of design thinking: the process, which is really what we're going to focus on today; the team, the emphasis here is on a multicultural, multi-faceted team. You don't want everybody on the team to think alike when you're going through this process. And then the space is very important because this is a collaborative type tool. There are times when you need to be together, and the space is important to accomplish this. This is the resource that I drew on for this discussion. There are lots of good resources on design thinking, but this one I think is a very easy to read, very easy to understand, but gives you really the essence of what's required here. So let's focus now on the process, and the process is really a 6-step process. It's laid out in a linear fashion, but the reality is there's a lot of iteration here. The first 3 steps in this process are really about the problem area, and then the second 3 steps, the 4, 5, and 6, are really associated with the solution area. So in terms of understanding the problem, that's step 1. I mean, so often we jump right into making the assumption that we understand what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So this framework really forces you to think about, do we really understand the problem? What do we know about the problem? What don't we know about it? Who's affected by it? So the whole idea is to come up with a common understanding of the problem and across the entire team. Secondly, then you go out and observe to try to look at customers experiencing this problem, to try to understand what their needs are. Customers will tell you a lot of things, but they can't always explicitly verbalize what their needs are. So it's up to you to bring those out in many cases. So things like interviews, customer visits, ethnography, which is really about putting your place in the shoes of the customer, so to speak. So these are all observation techniques that you can use to try to fill in the gaps now on what you think you understand the problem is and how customers are getting around that problem to try to figure out what their needs are. And then third, you got to kind of integrate all that. You got to take that information and create insights. You can use a simple type of process where you put those on Post-it notes and put them up on a whiteboard, and then try to cluster them into kind of groups of ideas or insights. You can use this tool that I introduced you to several months ago, the concept mapping tool. Is a powerful online tool that could be used in this context, particularly if you're dealing with a diverse team that's geographically dispersed. So the idea here is that you're really trying to get to a clear vision of the user needs, fears, goals, etc. Do you really understand what the problem is and what the needs of the customer are? So this is all what the problem area is concerned about. Then after that, then you can move into the solution area. Step 4 is to ideate, create a lot of new ideas. Of course, there are lots of great brainstorming techniques. Again, the concept mapping tool that I introduced you to can be effective for this. So that's the step 4. And then to prototype. The idea now is to take some of these solutions and do some quick and dirty prototyping. And I don't care what kind of company you are, you can find ways to do this type of thing. The idea here, this is the concept, the lean concept of fail fast and fail cheap. You're trying to use these simple prototypes to get at what the real needs of the customer are so that you can ultimately get to that product definition as we talked about in the decision model. and then after developing these prototypes, you test, right? You test that prototype, you get it into users' hands, and then you loop back. So this is the iterative nature of this whole process, where you might have to go all the way back. It might force you all the way back to step 1, or you might just want to come back up to step 5. It just depends on the context and what you're trying to do. Okay, so in summary, defining a new product really is about creating a shared vision. It helps prevent scope creep and helps reduce time to market. Secondly, I think the two big mistakes that companies make are either not using any kind of written definition and relying on hallway conversations, or defining a product based on a mistaken understanding of what the needs are, which then leads to a failure in the market once the product comes out. There are multiple types of written definition depending on where you are in the process. From the very beginning, the product business case brief that might be developed within the portfolio process, is a simple one-page type of document, but that really constitutes the first kind of formal definition, all the way to the marketing requirements document of the new product proposal as you get into the phase gate, as you get into development, and then ultimately maybe a product design specification document that really puts it in engineering terms. And I think hopefully you will agree that the product definition decision model that I laid out to you today can help you guide that effort, kind of as a mental model to work through what you really need to do in order to get to a good product definition. That model incorporates the type of project that you might be working on. It incorporates the competitive strategy, incorporates the variety of tools that we've used, and of course you may have other tools that might make sense, all of which are intended to get you to that fully defined, and not only fully defined, but to the point where you have much higher probability of when that product comes to market, it's going to meet the need of the customer. And ultimately, that's really what we're after. Okay, with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and we look forward to next month's webinar. Have a great day.